Very good. We'll start. The Spanish finally realized that Columbus had not landed in China, and they began to look for a passage around China, and they sent Ferdinand Magellan to go around South America. Ferdinand Magellan went down the South American coast and looking for a break in the coast, and he finally found the tip end of South America, went around it, went on to the Philippines. Went on to the Philippines. He did not conquer the Philippines himself, that was later, but then he was killed there in the Philippines, but his crew went on, and he is credited with being the first person to sail around the world, even though of the several men who started with him, only 18 of them finished the trip. But nevertheless, they charted the area, they discovered the Hawaiian Islands, and they proved that you could sail around the world. The Spanish went on to conquer the Philippines later, and that is why today the Filipinos speak Spanish. Now, in 1898, the United States took the Philippines from Spain. That's a subject for later chapters. But I want you to remember which nation got what. Portugal wound up with Brazil. Holland wound up with South Africa and Indonesia. Oh yes, the Dutch, the people who were born in Holland are known as Dutch. The Dutch who went to South Africa were called Boers. Now again, in the 1890s, Great Britain took South Africa from Holland. South Africa made news recently because its great leader, Nelson Mandela, died about a month ago. And Holland went on to conquer in what is today Indonesia. They called it the Dutch East Indies. So on your maps, it will appear on your maps as Dutch East Indies. I've got it down here as Indonesia. Holland was one of Europe's big countries until they had a civil war and split in two, and they became two nations, Holland and Belgium. But they were one of Europe's more powerful countries until that time. The French got involved in the explorations, and they took what is today Canada, mostly Quebec. They couldn't hold it. The British took Canada from them. I must mention also at this time, Holland set up a colony in what is today New York. They called it New Amsterdam. But the British came in and they took New Amsterdam from the Dutch. After all, the British already had Massachusetts to the north of New York, and they had Virginia to the south, and they said, we're going to take it all. So they took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and named it New York. France got Canada for a while, and that is why to this day the people of Quebec still speak French. England took the area of between what is today Georgia and Maine, south of Canada. And you might wonder about Florida. The Spanish had Florida first. Eventually, the United States bought Florida from Spain. But the area between Georgia and Maine, 13 colonies in all, or it wound up being 13 colonies. Now, your book does not go into detail about the Jamestown settlement, so don't worry about it. But the first English settlement that lasted was in Jamestown. The English tried to make two other attempts at settling North America that failed. But they settled Jamestown, and then they settled the Plymouth colony in 1620. Again, your book doesn't seem to want to mention that. They do mention that a lot of the colonists who came over here for England came for religious reasons. After emphasizing economics as being the big thing that motivated the French and the Spanish, especially the Spanish, a lot of the English people who came seem to have come for religious reasons. England was in a state of turmoil at this time, and we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. One thing, I'm looking at page 400 in the book right now. One thing I remember about Latin America, they had a real problem that they've had throughout their history, could not separate church from state. The state got itself entangled in church affairs from the beginning, and the church got itself entangled in state affairs beginning, and I don't know which side's more wrong than the other, but church and state remained united for the longest time, and they also very early in their history, they established a society where the rich were way up here, super rich, very, very rich, and the poor were extreme poor, very, very poor, and this was to remain true for the next 450 or so years. Now, in recent times, I understand there has been some progress made in Latin American countries in bringing the lower class people, improving the economic status of the lower class people. I understand there has been some progress in there, but for the most of Latin America's history, they were ruled by dictators. Church and state were one and the same, and they had a society with extreme wealth on the top, and with most people were living in extreme poverty on the bottom. And we'll be visiting Latin America several times throughout the rest of the semester. Your book mentions a movie called The Mission. It came out in 1986. Yes, I did happen to see it. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but in yesterday's class, no one in that class has seen it. It's likely no one here has either. So I'll just make passing mention of it because I did happen to see it. It describes a lot about Latin America. In fact, I'll say on a personal note, most of what I know about Latin American history I learned taking Spanish courses in high school and college. The only foreign language I ever took was Spanish, and they would give history about Paraguay going through terrible dictators, and about Mexico these countries tried to establish a democracy and somehow just simply seemingly couldn't. Then your book on page 404 goes into a speculation about Christopher Columbus. Was he a hero or villain? I want to say I do agree with the author's assessment of the man. Nobody can go outside their time era. Columbus was a man of his time era. Now, some 4 or 5 years ago, some young black student said to me, Abraham Lincoln was a racist. I said, yes, if you judge him by 2009 standards, that was the year. If you judge him by 21st century standards, he was a racist. But he was a man of his own time era. Just like George Washington. He was a man of his own time era. And you have to judge these men by the time era they lived. And you can't judge them by 21st century standards. I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and more than once I got in trouble for doing something I had done for years, and all of a sudden they made a new rule that outlawed what I'd been doing. And it caught more than one of us. I mean, at one point they made all the streets one-way streets. And several of us didn't catch that they had been made one-way streets. And we got busted, written up for going the wrong way on a one-way street. Eventually we learned, but it's a painful transitional time. But basically there were new rules in place. Christopher Columbus has been called a mass murderer. Again, he was a product of his own time period. I mustn't leave the subject of Africa without mentioning the slave trade. The first Europeans that's believed who got involved in the slave trade were the Portuguese, and the last Europeans to stop the slave trade were the Portuguese. Slavery had been outlawed in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Instead, Europe had the system of serfdom, and I'm jumping into the next chapter a little bit, but I'll talk more about serfs next chapter. Serfs were not considered slaves, and serfs could not be bought or sold. Slaves could be bought or sold. But then the Europeans ran into the Africans, and in the the continent of Africa, slavery seems to have been an issue from prehistoric times all the way to the present. There are rumors going on in two places in Africa, the Sudan and the Congo. There's still slavery and slave trade. And some Americans decided to go over and buy some slaves and turn them loose. Well, the Sudanese got the brilliant idea, hey, we can make money capturing slaves. So they let the Americans buy the slaves, turn them loose, and they'd recapture the slaves, so the Americans have to buy them again and turn them loose again. This just seems to have been a problem that they've had. The slave trade did make some mark on African demography. It greatly depopulated Africa. One reason for the slave trade was it is now known that persons who work with cattle have some immunity to smallpox and typhus. Africans had cattle, so they had some immunity to those diseases. The American Indians had none. So they tried enslaving American Indians, but they had a big problem that the American Indians died too quickly. And also the American Indians could more easily escape because they knew where the hiding places were and knew where to, they had friendly natives to help them stay hidden. Africans did not know their way around and had a more difficult time escaping because they didn't know where to go. Also, like I said, Africans had some immunity to smallpox and to typhus, which meant they would probably live longer, and in general make more profitable slaves than the American Indians did. Most of the slaves found their way to the Americas, a few into Europe. The passage was called the Middle Passage, and the slaves were put on ships and put on generally on lower decks, the decks that were so low that they couldn't even sit up in them, so they had to crawl into their compartment and stay there until they were allowed to come up and exercise a bit. Many of the Africans who were brought to the Americas died, but then some historians have done research and said an equal percentage of white slaveholders who carried them also died. The diseases the Africans had would spread to the slaveholders also, and a lot of the crew would perish along with their slaves. And a lot of the culprits in the slave trade were Africans themselves who would make money, make profit, by capturing other Africans and selling them to the Europeans who came in to catch the slaves. So the Africans were not entirely innocent in this process. Slavery was to remain in the Americas. In the 1820s, most of your Latin American countries outlawed it. The last country to outlaw it was Brazil in 1880. The next to last major country that outlawed it was the United States, who outlawed it in 1865, 15 years before Brazil did. Your Spanish countries outlawed it rather quickly. Now, I'm going to have more to say about it later, but again, your Spanish-speaking countries, as they got their independence from Spain, they set up constitutions that outlawed slavery. In the case of Portugal, they never got their independence. Well, eventually they did, but they didn't have to fight a war to get their independence from Portugal. And they didn't feel any pressure to let go of the slave trade like their Spanish-speaking neighbors did. Again, the subject of how mankind came to look on slavery as being wrong, that's a subject for later chapters, particularly chapters 18 and 19, thereabouts. We'll talk about how mankind eventually came to believe that slavery was wrong, and more countries of the world outlawed it. Southeast Asia. One thing I want you to remember about Southeast Asia is the primary religion of this part of the world was Islam and Buddhism. At least the religion of the civilized people living there. Now in your jungles, your rainforests, whatever you call them, the primary religion was animism, nature worship, spirit worship. But among your civilized people living on the coast and in your cities, they tended to divide between Buddhism and Islam. Confucianism was there, Hinduism was there, Christianity made a few converts, but the main religions were these two. The book spends several paragraphs talking about kingship, how the Islamic people looked on the king, and how the Buddhism looked on the king. I'll let you read it for yourself. I'm not going to hold you responsible for much of that. The one thing, though, I do want to mention before leaving this, the economy, as was a case of most of the world, was based on agriculture. Now, in the United States today, it's probably about 1 person in 20, or maybe even 1 person in 25 in this country is a farmer. I mean, a full-time farmer. I'm not talking about someone who grows a little postage stamp-sized garden or raises a few chickens. I'm talking about a full-time farmer. Very small percent of population, but throughout most of mankind's history, 90 or more percent of your people had to be farmers in order for the society to subsist. But today we have tractors, combines, reapers, machinery that makes farming more practical. Farming was also a great industry here because they had a year-round summer, no fall, no winter, year-round summer, which enabled them to grow 3 or 4 crops a year on the same land. So they could farm a crop, harvest it, turn right around and farm another. The rains were predictable. They have a rainy season and a dry season, and the rains are, like I say, highly predictable, and they know when to plant. I mean, you have to plant at a certain time, and you have to harvest at a certain time, but they do have seasons in it that have rain, wet and dry.